All right.
I'm really happy
So,
to be here, so thank you.
so I'll be throwing in questions, and you guys can go freestyle, and whoever feels like responding first, you go for it. I feel totally comfortable. I think you guys are all very rational people, and so I don't think I'm gonna need much moderation here. But throwing you on a question about individualism first, because it was brought by Dan. Is individualism, in people's view on this stream, is individualism contradictory with any form of nationalism, including racial nationalism?
Well, I mean, depends on what you mean by individualism. Some people go for like full atomization, where any duty to something bigger than yourself is bad. Others say you need some sort of group identity to be fully actualized as an individual. I'm more of the latter philosophy, and therefore I don't think it is contradictory, at least not inherently.
Yeah, I would. Oh, sorry. I would
it.
want more specification for like what is actually meant by individual, because I'm thinking of, I mean, because there's an old anarchist argument or communist anarchist argument that they'll say for an individual to truly manifest, he has to have a certain level of economic security, for example, and say that to truly allow the individual to be free, to the free individual, he has to have certain like positive rights. And I'm not sure about this. Maybe even Sargon believes that the NHS is sort of required to maximize individual liberty. So I would want to know what is meant by individualism from the liberalists.
Mm-hmm.
So by virtue of what you just said, that you need an economic status to be an individual, that's incorrect, because I come from a very poor background.
I'm not saying that that's my position. I'm just saying that there's disagreement on what's needed for individualism.
And Sargon kind of takes that position too when he like argues with libertarians.
Well, Sargon can speak for himself, or Sargon.
But the problem is that
I'm not going to ask you to speak. I'm not going to ask you to speak on behalf of Richard Spencer, for instance.
Well, the difference is that Spencer doesn't really speak for much of anyone, whereas Sargon is sort of the only thought leader I know of in the liberalists. So that's why we're using him as a baseline. It's fine if you disagree, and we could get into that, but that's sort of where we're starting from.
Well, I'd rather not make you answer for the worst of your ideology.
I suspect you're going to try, to be honest.
Well, you can suspect a lot. Yeah, that's for sure. The thing is, individualism to me is basically just acting in the best manner for yourself, your family, and your community. To me, an individual is like Sisyphus. You take on great burdens on your shoulders. You put the weight of responsibility, and you carry it gladly, because life is inherently suffering. You're going to have a lot more sadness than joy. So essentially, for me, being an individual does not mean the anarcho garbage of being atomized, because no one is truly atomized. I mean, consider, for instance, a baseball team. Everyone wears the same uniform. The manager hands over the lineup card, but it's the merits of the individual that determine where you stand in the lineup.
And you get nowhere unless the team wins.
Well, you get nowhere unless you can play as a team. And if the team is not judged accordingly in a proper, rational manner, that's when the manager fails.
That's good. I think we agree then, because that was sort of my take as well.
Okay, so I think that this is just sort of what I've gleaned from listening to like about an hour of the liberalists on the liberalist channel, talking to a bunch of people, is basically you guys support a proposition, what I would call a proposition filter state, where the country is based on, conforming to a certain set of political ideas, and immigration is to filter for people who will who will maintain those ideas or who believe in those ideas, right?
Not right. Personally, when you said earlier that race is primary, or you believe it to be so, yet in multiple studies, Americans generally place their religious identification above that of their race, and that cuts across every racial spectrum. Now, the country based on political ideas, maybe the law is, but it should be based on principles of meritocracy, for instance, and separation of powers and limited government, in the idea that the government should be the government should be limited towards what they do in people's lives.
Which group believes in limited government, though?
Essentially, American conservatives would be a good bet.
What color are they?
There are a broad swath of colors. You have Tim Scott from South Carolina. We have an Asian Republican up here in Connecticut.
I mean, we can look at who votes Republican. It's not really a broad swath of colors compared to the other coalition.
And I doubt it's based on race. It essentially switched places after the South became less agrarian and more industrialized.
It is.
Yeah, I think everyone knows that that's just two political parties. Nobody, for example, you could say Martin Luther King was a Republican, but today he
was a conservative because he wanted to conserve liberal values.
Everyone.
No, he wanted.
No, he did not. No, he didn't.
Okay, so a Southern
he
black
wanted reparations.
was not. A Southern pastor was not conservative. He was against gay equal rights first.
Not in
he
the
may have spoken about
maybe.
Excuse me. Can you calm down? He was like you can say he was not a conservative in the way conservative is used today, right? When we say conservative, there's a specific meaning regarding the political views of conservatives, quote unquote, in the United States. You can say he's a conservative in some sort of broader historical sense that he wanted to conserve something, whatever. Also, him being anti-gay or against gay marriage, that was like you had to be any kind of political actor in the 1960s.
Or a pastor. Or
a pastor. But also, in terms of him being like for classical liberalism, he wanted to, basically his movement was about ending free association and about using the government to force whites to interact with blacks. And he was also for reparations, right? He said prior to the March on Washington, D.C., that we are coming for our check, right? He was very open about wanting, reparations from...
simply holding an idea like reparations, or I guess you can call it, what would Bernie Sanders term it? Wealth redistribution.
Sure.
It's not inherent of any political sway, because even Friedrich Hayek, he saw the utility in a national health system, for instance. And he's noted as a libertarian, classical liberal thinker.
But we can say which side it falls more on to want reparations.
Right.
Another thing I want to bring up another thing about this religion thing, about people identifying more with religion. I'm referring to the Generation Forward survey, which only looked at millennials. So that may be a difference here. So I'm looking at millennials, and for them, religion is below, for basically every group, below economic class and below race for every racial group here, for millennials.
Right. And millennials are the smallest voting percentage of all age groups.
Yeah, right, but they're the youngest. Yep, they're the future.
So now you look at Gen Z, you see a map of Gen Z, electoral map, who they would have voted for, and it's a clear-cut victory for Trump.
They would have voted for Trump. But I'm saying regarding the racial identity,
and even when you look at religious, not indoctrination, what's the word I'm looking for? Religious practice, fundamentalism is making a broad comeback compared to the
among Gen Z,
amongst all Americans. This was only looking at Americans.
Right, but among Gen Z Americans, religion is making a comeback, or
not that I've seen, but I'm open to the idea of that happening. If they're going to be more conservative, then they're likely to be more religious. There's some kind of connection, personality.
But the thing is, like according to this survey, race absolutely dumpsters religion for African Americans, Asian Americans.
And that makes sense for kids, because kids need a group identity. Like children need a group identity.
Even among the whites here, it's 40% identify with their race, 31%. Right.
And they're young.
Religion.
And the children need a group identity. They need to fit in.
Right. And adults don't?
Not necessarily. Not the successful adults.
This is related to a super chat from William Monberg. He says, how do liberalists screen millions of people for ideological conformity? How do they break down people who view themselves racially? I would ask this question to Dan. You claim that there would be a change in adult life of non-racial identification and more religious identification. Do you have evidence for this, or is that your impression?
I can find evidence, I guarantee it. It's just I'm not going to be going on my computer to check every single little thing.
The people who run the NAACP,
I would say that when adults have children, their children become their primary care, and that might be one of the biggest things that happens when you become an adult. You have children, your family grows, you have a mortgage, you got things to pay for. You really have no concern for really anything of what we're doing, to be honest. And we, I mean all of us in this stream right now.
I have children, and I think it's important But we do
Oh,
what we're
good.
doing.
You haven't talked much. You should contribute. I mean, I want to hear what you have to say. I'm not trying to be a dick.
Get a word in anyways, to be honest. You were all rolling off each other quite nice. I didn't want to interrupt.
Well, let's let him talk. That's what I mean.
Yep.
What's the original question?
So let's hear you on the question. Is individualism contradictory in your view of individualism with group identity of all kinds, including racial identity?
It's not contradictory with racial identity if you consider yourself not to have one.
Okay.
It's contradictory if you look at on the nationalist level. I agree that nationalism is in of itself collectivist because it has to be, in a sense. And I've always maintained the position that I am an individual within my own nation, but a collectivist on the national scale.
Well, I would put my nation above that of other nations.
So now going into the meat of the subject, if I was to ask to each of you, why would we choose racial nationalism over civic nationalism or vice versa? Defend your preference on that particular question. Is civic nationalism better than racial nationalism?
If I may go first, I can answer it with one statement. I have family members who are not the same race as me. So why wouldn't I want to defend them? So if I want to defend them, because they're my blood and flesh, then I would pick up the torch of civic nationalism, not racial nationalism. So that's my position on it.
I'll go next. My position is that the issue with civic nationalism is that it doesn't cash in on its own promises. Even among non-whites who agree with the Republican Party, they still vote with their race for the Democrat Party. And that's just simple racial dimension to politics that civic nationalists can't bridge, don't know how to bridge. And it means they can't really get away with being colorblind like they'd like to.
Well, I'd say it's not a question of what's preferable. It requires cultural power and sway. And I do not see a white nationalist movement having that kind of sway outside of the internet.
Okay. One thing I would say is kind of a problem with the civic nationalist thing. And again, I don't know, for example, because my perception was that you guys proposed, the civic nationalism, what is the civic based on? Is it based on an idea?
Liberal values, I would assume.
I would base it on the writings of Rousseau, even though his social contract was flawed.
Okay, so it's a proposition state. That's all I'm asking about. So I think the first problem with it is that there's kind of a collective action problem regarding state actors and what we would call nations or groups of people in terms of how they should go about this. For example, let's say you were to convert France, UK, Germany, Italy. You're able to convert all these countries into a proposition state. They're no longer a blood and soil state, but they're a proposition state. What would then happen is that the Chinese then would have access to both China, but also to this new proposition land, as long as they were libertarian. So that's, I think, or as long as they were Rousseauian or whatever the proposition happens to be. Whereas the white Europeans would only have access to this proposition nation. So for any individual group actor, the best play is blood and soil. Even if worldwide it would be better for every country on the planet to adopt a kind of liberalist proposition nation, for any single actor, the best choice is blood and soil. So I think
it's a doves and hawks problem.
Yeah, so it really makes me think of my past in the game theoretic field and how we study strategies. And sometimes there are possible strategies that you could adopt, and that if in theory the other player would also adopt, would be better for everyone in some instances. But there's a reality where other countries, as Ryan puts it, other countries will play the game of blood and soil. And in that instance, if you open your border more than them, you are the only player getting fucked by all others. Do you recognize that this is a reality, the liberalist and Dan?
I think liberal values require strong national borders. And the thing is, the collective identity plays second. It's always going to be there underneath, and it comes forth when it's needed, much like we had in World War II. That's about it.
But are you saying that we should have a state that has more open borders than other states who are based on race? For example, if China decides to make its policies based on race and based on the capacity of reproduction of its own people doesn't it make you weak if you choose to open your borders?
Yes, that's why I'm not for open borders. And somebody mentioned strategy. That'd be a good place to talk on. I mean, what's the strategy for an ethno state in America? I mean, what does an alt-right political movement look like on the streets, on the street level, or in the political field? I mean, how would that work?
Well, that's going away from the talk about competing ideas, but I can basically say an ethno state in America would basically be one of two things. It'd be like a set aside for whites, or it would just be a return to sort of Eurocentric policy, Eurocentric immigration norms. Because as you know, we use Israel as an example of an ethno state. People like come back with sort, well, Israel's 30% Arab. Well, the definition of ethno state is merely securing ethnocultural continuity, which Israel absolutely does. A country like Germany, which is more German than Israel is Jewish, is not an ethno state because they're not doing that.
Right.
And in fact, they're doing the opposite.
So I just one of my concerns is dysgenic breeding. How would we control for dysgenic breeding in a white ethno state?
Well, it'd actually be easier because you would have people in charge theoretically of a white ethno state who definitely care about genetics and dysgenics. I would say it's more likely to have dysgenic breeding under a liberal system or a social democrat system.
I mean, simply caring isn't a solution. It's going to be a problem.
Well, what's
do
the
you want a specific policy?
what's the liberalist?
I want an
solution?
idea of what that would look like.
Just do what Galton said, and encourage the virtuous to have more kids.
How do the liberalists solve it?
Yeah.
Just how do you solve dysgenic breeding?
How do you do it in a liberalist way?
Well, politics are downstream from culture, so it's more of an ontological problem than any kind of political problem. So you would have to arrange the culture in such that people know the consequences of who they're sleeping with and to self-select themselves towards the traits they want.
Okay,
Well,
so there's
there's
no mechanism in the liberalist system any more than there's inherently a mechanism in the white ethno state to prevent dysgenic breeding.
Yeah.
So,
Well, if you look at Appalachian whites, they have a lower average IQ than Black Americans, so it could very much be a problem.
I'm not sure. I know I think the IQ of West Virginia, for example, is around 94, and it's like it's 90 something percent white. So I think Appalachian whites are like in the low to mid 90s.
The idea then is that I don't think the ethno state will be overtaken by Appalachian whites. And anyway, what Alt-type is bringing is the fact that you don't have any more mechanism than those we could very well implement in an ethno state. You're talking about free choice. You're talking about sexual selection. These processes will be undergoing in any free society, including the white ethno state.
Well, these concerns exist in other ethno states. You named Israel and their sects of Judaism, which test DNA of prospective spouses. You have Sweden, Norway, all the Nordic countries. They have a history of eugenics forced by the state.
Mm-hmm. They do. Yeah, Israel actually does have a big problem with particularly useless religious sects having a lot of kids.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that would be a problem for a white ethno state. It's like when people say, well, Japan is this sexless society. It's like, well, that's specific to Japan. It doesn't mean copying their immigration policy would create it.
Right. Another thing regarding the white ethno state is when you take a bunch of people, like the kind of people who tend to be white nationalists, tend to be very in favor of having a lot of kids and also in favor or more in favor of eugenics than the general population. I perceive this to be. I haven't seen data on this or a poll, but the issue of dysgenics is something that's talked about, I think, among the alt-right, quote unquote, more so than just about any other group. So having a country of these a white ethno state, even if there's no sort of like either in the Constitution rule for a eugenics program, just it stands to reason that a eugenics program would be much more likely to come about in a white ethno state than anywhere else.
Yeah, it's about what kind of personality is drawn to these ideas that you can make these kinds of predictions.
I think one question I would want to ask about this is when talking about the proposition state. What I seem to notice is that we tend to talk about converting some sort of European country into one of these proposition states. Wouldn't it be, and it just seems weird that that would be sort of the point you would want it to start at, given that Europe tends to be much more libertarian based on indexes of economic freedom, and tends to be much wealthier than basically the rest of the world, except for a few pockets in Asia. So wouldn't the like ground zero of this liberalist proposition state, wouldn't you want it to be somewhere like Africa, where there's much more potential upside than in the UK, for example?
Yeah, it's risky to bet the phenotype on this social engineering project, I would say.
All right. So to launch people on another question, we have a super chat. Marcus Delap, €5. How likely does the failure of the liberalist project, parenthesis, converting minorities, have to be for you to prefer a white ethno-state? In other words, he's saying, would you recognize that in certain worlds, even your liberalist ideals and your ideas concerning individual freedom, there are some people who cannot adhere to that because they are genetically different, they have different cultural transmission system? Would you be willing to adhere to a view that sometimes your political project as liberalist cannot be adhered to by everyone on this planet?
Yeah, I would. Well, I'm not an imperialist. But I don't want it on every nation on the planet. I just want it in my nation.
Yeah, now what happens if in your
Influence
nation there are
majority.
people who
Yeah,
cannot
yeah.
subscribe to your desire?
Well, then they have to.
Why?
Because a nation should not be afraid of imposing freedom on people.
Well, I mean, I bring this up because, like, for the past 50 years, all our social policy has revolved around fixing the plight of the Black community, and nothing's changed. And in some cases, it's gotten worse. And so my question is, it sounds like you're sort of betting a lot on it working out this time. And so that's sort of what the question's getting at is, what do you do if it doesn't work out again?
Well, here's the deal. It doesn't matter if it fails as a political movement because it's an individual movement. And if you act in the way an individual should, and you keep your promises or you work hard, you will have better outcomes. The people who have poorer outcomes have it by choice. If you want to be middle class in America, don't have kids before marriage, keep a job, and graduate high school. It's that simple.
I definitely agree with that. But the thing is that people do not like blaming themselves for their own failures. And a lot of politics revolves around that instinct. And people especially don't like thinking their entire group is failing. And so that's why we have these kinds of voting patterns we do.
The culture right now revolves around that instinct of not taking responsibility.
No, I mean that's a.
I think human biology revolves around the instinct of not taking responsibility.
I mean, every war is justified by a victim narrative, like what we see in politics now. So it's not just what the Democrat Party is doing right now. It is
if human beings. Sorry.
Yeah, it's a part of human nature, and yeah, I'll just end it there.
If it's part of human nature not to take on responsibility, we would have died out millions of years ago.
No,
it's a matter of degree. It's a matter of degree.
Yeah, I mean, it's especially not. It's especially
take on responsibility. They wouldn't have gotten anywhere.
Okay,
like they got to.
We're talking about. Okay, it's the question. It's not the question of people being responsible enough to get enough calories to survive. Obviously, they did. It's the question of why are these other people richer than me?
Yeah.
Why is this other ethnic group better off than me?
Okay. Due to outcomes that are inherently unequal. If you look at unemployed men,
you can say that. You can say that, but blacks won't accept it.
Biologically wired. We're biologically
blacks won't accept it, and most whites won't accept it.
We're biologically wired to work and labor, and you can see that in the results of unemployed men and their suicide rates.
Yeah, but we still have unemployed men, so it's more complicated than that.
You're always going to have. That's the problem with conservatives. They don't understand that there's some people that just can't work because they're not smart enough.
And they're not going to accept that they just suck. Is sort of my point.
Okay.
I mean,
so
yeah, that's the fair point. That's how what conservatives have a blind spot on.
Now, Dan, I would say, and I'm pretty stunned by the liberalist answer. that you want to impose freedom on people who don't want it, and you
Not the
feel
liberalist
no
answer.
problem.
My answer. I don't speak for the liberalists.
I'm saying I'm standing at the liberalist answer, and I want to introduce my question to you now, because you say impose freedom on people who don't want it. You have no problem with this. The problem with freedom is that it's a social contract, and it works if everyone respects it. If there's a group of your population that does not fundamentally respect the freedom on which the rest of society agreed, you're opening the whole of society to have acts of aggression be committed against it by this minority. If this minority is a problem, is there a point at which you will acknowledge that including them in your liberalist project would be damaging to the project itself?
No, because I believe that at some point they will want freedom. I don't believe that anybody, regardless of their culture or ideology, will outright flat refuse freedom if imposed upon them. Like, okay, let me go with an example. We have a large issue with Islamic population in Britain. Yeah. Now, the reason that this isn't just because their culture is authoritarian and lacks freedom. It's partly because our conservative and to a degree social liberal Labour parties haven't enforced the ideals of British values upon them. So the problem is we've allowed foreign imams to come into the country and radicalise young men. These young men, and I'm going back 20 years, these young men have then had children, started radicalising their children, so on and so forth. We've allowed them to be sectarian in their approach to British life. So you'll have 5-year-old children wearing hijabs and all this sort of stuff. And that's not a failure. That's not a failure of British values or of liberalist values. That's a failure. Young men have then had children, started radicalising their children, so on and so forth, and lacks freedom. It's partly because our conservative and to a degree social liberal Labour parties haven't enforced the ideals of British values upon them. So the problem is we've allowed foreign imams to come into the country and radicalise young men. These young men, and I'm going back 20 years, these young men have then had children, started radicalising their children, so on and so forth. We've allowed them to be sectarian in their approach to British life. So you'll have 5-year-old children wearing hijabs and all this sort of stuff. And that's not a failure. That's not a failure of British values or of liberalist values. That's a failure of government policy.
It's a failure of liberalist values, because these imam, what they've done it through individual rights that are part of your system. They've done it because they had the possibility to do it. By which standard is the imam wrong in your system, given that you're such an individualist? And if the imam thinks that God told him to do this and that he successfully convinces someone else that it's the case, it's the liberalist values that are at play here. This is what's been going on in your country for more than 50 years, and this is what liberalist values lead to: imams convincing others of the Muslim culture.
I disagree.
May I add something first? I would also point out, I see this a lot, this it's sort of excusing the failure of integrating Islam on the fact that they self-segregate. Well, self-segregation is a two-way street because most people don't want Muslims as neighbors. So just ending their self-segregation's not going to change much, I would say. Just that.
Well, if you don't want a minority to be a problem, you don't allow them to form ethno-states, essentially.
Yeah, but
well, I think having them form an ethno-state I think having them form as an ethno-state is precisely how you have them not be a problem, because then they're in a new country. You can build a big, beautiful wall around them.
Nations don't go to war.
What?
Nations don't go to war with each other.
They do.
What?
I believe
was that sarcasm? Okay, well.
that was sarcasm. Okay.
Competing groups in the same polity also.
No, that was an honest question. Nations don't go to war with each other. I mean.
Oh, that was a question. Oh,
nations doesn't mean they won't have conflict.
Correct. Two countries could go to war with each other, so let's end all countries or something.
Yes.
Okay.
I'm not arguing for ending countries. I'm arguing for recognizing.
My answer is, I'm going to answer it with a question. I know that's kind of BS, but I'm going to do it. Competing groups in the same polity who don't get along and share any organic attachment also go to war with one another, and those wars tend to be worse.
Right. And honestly, if you look at migration data in America of in out-state migration, you see the out-group states, the the ones with the most out-migration are these progressive states in America. Not liberal, progressive. There's a big difference between liberals and progressives. And that's one of equality of outcome. It's sort of the Oedipal mother devouring her children. They claim they care, like their opening of the welfare state in the 60s, and they make the outcomes worse for them. So when you look at these states without migration, they're moving to the number one state is Idaho. And it falls in line like South Dakota, Washington State, Oregon, South Carolina, Vermont, states that are 95% white or greater. And that's a reflection of human nature and progressive policies. That has nothing to do with anyone advocating for an ethno-state. So can you really take credit for that? I don't think so.
Well, I'm not taking credit for that, but I would say like the Californians who are leaving California still vote like they did in California.
Right. They're going to move to a state they view as progressive, and they're going to continue those policies.
Yeah, I don't know about the people who left, though. I think the people who left might be more conservative, but
slightly. But they're less conservative than the place they're moving. But the thing is that the fact that this isn't changing just because they moved is a problem for a proposition nation, I would say, because the same holds true for immigrant groups.
I think it's a problem of narrative, because the progressive establishment media, which is, I think we'd agree, pretty much a hegemon, like just in control. It's the progressive media. And in 20 years' time, once this natural migration, and thanks to Colin for this information, he knows who he is. Once this migration is completed and these states like California, Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York are complete shitholes, they'll turn around and blame that, not on their policies, but on the alt-right, even if it's not true. They'll use you as a smokescreen.
Okay. Well, I think that'll be. Well, I think that would be good, because then they would draw the lines.
Then they can continue their progressive policies. That's good. They will never take responsibility.
That would be good, because it would then draw the line. Because then they would be elevating the alt-right. Because there's going to be a whole bunch of people, for example, in Wyoming, in North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Idaho, who don't like Californians. They don't like those liberals, right? They don't like them. So basically when these people in California are calling them alt-right, and they're going to be calling them a bunch of other stuff, white supremacists, they're going to be calling these people here all sorts of names, and they're going to draw the line and sort of, I guess what we say, as Malcolm X said, make it plain and force them to sort of take sides. So
if I may, if I may, because this is a two-way debate, what will you do if people do not accept racial nationalism? You've asked what we would do. What will you do?
Okay. I'll talk about the specific, and I can only give sort of my ideal explanation of how this would be. I can't really, how the world will actually operate is going to be crazy and wild and all that stuff. But just sort of the ideal.
What's crazy and wild, man?
Complicated.
I'm just going to give you the ideal of what I propose, right? Because how things actually play out in the real world are obviously infinitely more complicated. So when I ask for the liberalist position, I'm sort of asking for the sort of end phenomenon. I'm not necessarily asking for how are you going to achieve it. That's crazy. That's wild. You can't predict all that stuff. So my ideal
specifics, in other words.
Okay. The way I see this happening specifically out of the United States is you have a cluster of states. You have Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, North Dakota, and South Dakota is what I see as the prime candidate area for the white ethno state. And what you do, these states are all over 80% white, and the non-white proportion of these states happens to be Native American, and that's actually good because there's a certain way to deal with them. And the way what you do there is you take an area that's already about 80% white, that's classified as the white ethno state, either as a separate country or as a semi-autonomous entity within the U.S. A bunch of white people will start to move there immediately, right? Because there's about 13 million people who openly identify as alt-right. I think there's somewhere around 30 million in total. And I think that number would go up. And so then you have an area that's going to be 80% white at the start, and then you say, hey, for the non-whites in this area, perhaps we'll pay you to leave. Also, you don't allow any non-white immigration into the area. So So the natural emigration, people leaving, non-whites leaving North Dakota for jobs somewhere else, they're not going to be replaced by other non-whites coming back in. So these are just in that way you end up with a 90+% white country, and then we as you have a whole bunch of people who are sort of on the program of keeping it that way and also looking out for the interests of whites worldwide. For example, giving refugee status to all whites in South Africa, for example.
Okay. So I didn't ask how you were going to create an ethno-state. I asked what you're going to do with people who do not accept racial nationalism. What about the 80% of all people that are already living in this designated area? What if that 80% or 10? What if 10% of those white people do not accept racial nationalism?
I don't know.
Are you asking what happens if our
can-
ideas?
I'm asking you the same question you asked us.
Well,
I'm
yeah.
not asking how you create an ethno-state. I'm asking what you do if
in my explanation of how it's created, I think it sort of implied the answer, which is that it's just an area with a white-only immigration policy, and they can leave, they can stay, they can do whatever. But
yeah, I mean,
what if they don't want to leave? You're emigrating into their land.
You can just stay there.
What do you mean their land? They're part of the United States.
Well, you just said you designate a part.
California's good. Let me ask you this: What if a bunch of people in Idaho don't want the federal government settling a bunch of Somalis into their area?
That's up to the people in the state. That's true. Now you said 30
no,
million.
It's not up to the people in the state. The federal government just sends them in. The federal government just owns them in.
What he's talking about is like what libertarians did when they went to Vermont to affect the politics. That's kind of what
New Hampshire.
New Hampshire, sorry, not Vermont. That's Bernie Sanders' land.
So you're saying 30 million alt-right, 10% of the population. And if I can forward that as
30 million max, I think.
Yeah.
Basically, I think 13 million is the low end and 30 million is the max end.
Right. So between 4 to 10%, maybe 3 to 10%.
Yeah.
So why did David Duke only get less than 3% of the vote in Deep South Louisiana?
Well, first off, there's a whole bunch of reasons. I mean, I wouldn't vote for Duke.
Yeah, and sometimes you ask these little strategic questions that have nothing to do with the subject.
Really, percentages have nothing to do.
Who cares why David Duke? Alternative hypothesis is giving you actual
30
data
million
from
people.
listen to me.
30 million
Listen
people.
Listen to me. Alternative hypothesis is bringing actual.
Party.
All right, I'm going to mute this guy. This guy is starting to annoy me, okay? So you're muted. Now, here's what's happening here, people who are listening to us. Alternative hypothesis brings an actual scientific survey that tells you the actual position of the people. Mr. Dan, Butterfly, whoever, starts asking, why did David Duke not get the votes? Well, David Duke had a platform. He had media access of a certain size. This is not related to the amount of support in the general population, which was Al-Type's point. So please respect me when I speak, Dan. And now I will. Now you can unmute you, and you guys can continue. But you are coming with these unrelated points that annoy me to the extreme.
May I say something? JF, are you a participant in this or a moderator?
I am a Mode Viper.
A Mode Viper.
I spit poison on people when I don't like them.
But I mean, a lot of your guys'
participant.
A lot of your guys' questions are about what happens.
We need to get this right first, because if you're a participant, then I think it's only fair that we get a third participant.
I am moderator the way I always was, and I follow my rules for moderation, which is that when someone evades the question or tries to ask little passive-aggressive questions that are completely unrelated to the subject, I'll call it out. This is why people listen to me. If you don't like it, you can leave. But you guys have been escaping questions that are legitimate, that we've asked, and you guys switch the subject all the time. I'm not going to let it go.
I answered the questions. I answered the questions fully.
You did, and I appreciate you.
Dan came up with a counterpoint to Alt-Hype's 30 million remark. I thought it was legit.
All right, well, now he can unmute himself, and with me having called out the straw manning that he was doing and the unrelated and the non sequitur points that he was bringing, he can make his case.
And also, we're talking about conceptual ideas. I mean, both of our movements could fail if they prove to be unpopular. And you could argue there are conceptual reasons why they would prove to be unpopular. That's fine. But, we're talking about ideas here. That's kind of the point.
I guess what Billy's getting at is, and I apologize for the cognitive dissonance I initiated. The thing about what Billy's asking is how far would you go to get an ethno-state? And I'm not trying to make a moral argument, because I don't think what you're advocating for entirely is ever immoral. It's pretty much, and not to make a false equation here, it's pretty much what like La Raza or any Pan-African group, you know, you have, let's say, not only the biological imperative, but the
it's also the United States.
It's not inherently
the United States. Sure, it's also the United States at its founding. It's also what all European and European offshoot countries were until, I mean, where you cut the date as to when they became, you know, open borders and is sort of different for different countries. But between the 50s and 60s was when the United States and Western Europe moved away from white-only immigration and tolerating a few minorities to being, you know, this cosmopolitan, open to the world sort of idea.
Well, it happened before the 1960s. During World War II, for instance, the U.S. government changed the definition of white to include Hispanics, like Mexicans, for the workforce.
Well, there you go. So it's a little slightly before as well. So, but the thing is, you recognize a change that occurred. That what we're talking about is not like. Let me put it this way. I think there's an error in that you're talking about our ideas as if they're, for example, new, or as if there's something that is like, here's a new idea that has to be sort of proven. It's just white countries, you know, 95% white countries are not some esoteric concept that needs to be proven whether or not they can work.
They exist today and have existed throughout history.
I'm not saying at all that tribalism is some kind of new idea. It's, you know, it's the default position for instance, children when they're growing up. They want to be part of the cool kid crew, you know, in high school
adults,
and such.
And adults, unless they're
individuals,
unless they're taught otherwise.